Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter podcast. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always by my co-host Nick Filato. And I didn't say the Big Blue Banter New York Giants football podcast this time because I don't know. I just felt like changing it up a little bit and seeing what people thought about that. I saw some comments recently. People don't like the New York Giants football part of it, but you know what? It's part of our DNA here at the Big Blue Banter. So we're going to keep doing it most of the time. Today I gave you a little reprieve, but today we wanted to do a draft profile combination thing today. So we're going to, instead of doing one player for this draft profile, it's a 3-player draft profile that also looks more 30,000 foot view into one. Is this position the Giants should invest in early at 25 with these 3 guys as the big 3 at the position? And 2, what do the Giants look for at this position? What can help them unlock more of their offense based on some of the film we saw with the player who played the position for the Giants last year, John Feliciano? So without further ado, obviously we're talking centers today. We're going to talk about the big 3 centers in this draft class. John-Michael Schmitz out of Minnesota, another Big Ten guy, Joe Tippmann out of Wisconsin. Of course, I'm going to be excited about him. He's a Badger. You all know how I feel about that team. And then another Big Ten guy, Luke Wypler out of Ohio State. These are the big 3 centers right now heading into this draft, at least at this time. And so we're going to talk about a bunch about who they are, how they could fit the Giants system, what kind of plays, what kind of different run and pass plays the Giants could utilize if they drafted any of these players, and then where we would want to take them if and when we want to take them. So Nick, where do you want to start here with these 3 players? Where's the best starting point?
I think we should start with John-Michael Schmitz out of Minnesota. He is my highest graded of these 3. I still have to watch some of the back end centers because I'm not necessarily advocating the Giants must take a center at pick 25. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit later. But if they were to go in that direction, John-Michael Schmitz is the center that I would like. But there is a little bit of a projection with John-Michael Schmitz just because we didn't see him run a ton of power gap, right? He was a lot of zone at Minnesota, a lot of base, a lot of climb up to the second level, some duo, right? Inside zone, stuff like that. Outside zone, reach blocks, scoop blocks, things along those lines. I think it's important before we get into his evaluation to talk about Bobby Johnson and to talk about Brian Dable's offense. Last year, the Giants started the season off by running a ton of power gap, right? A ton of pullers, trying to get Andrew Thomas out into space, got John Feliciano out into space. I felt like John Feliciano, for like a 30-year-old interior offensive lineman the Giants got off the scrap heap, he moved pretty well. I felt like I saw that at Buffalo as well. He can truck himself into space, locate, drive the guy away. He's not, I feel like, as quick as some of these other players, just betting on their trades. But John-Michael Schmitz specifically, we didn't really see him move that much into space. You saw it with Joe Tippmann. He pulled. You saw it with Luke Wypler. He folded a lot. What I mean by folded is on outside zone schemes, you can fold block. The Giants did it a ton this year. What I mean by fold block is the guard, if there's a 2 technique or a 2-eye technique, meaning he's on the inside shoulder of the play side guard, the guard blocks down, the center folds around it. So he essentially pulls. So it looks like it's a power gap concept, but that's just basically a tag on an outside zone run. So we saw that a lot from the New York Giants last season with John Feliciano. And just looking at John-Michael Schmitz's, I would say, overall athletic ability, even though he didn't necessarily test all that well, but from his movement ability, I think he will translate well to execute those types of blocks. And I'm sure he folded at Minnesota when they ran outside zone and things like that, but it wasn't necessarily, they didn't run a lot of power gap concept.
And that was just part of the beauty of the 2022 season, Nick, from a coaching standpoint. We had been accustomed to many years, in my opinion, even the Jason Garrett years. Like, it was obviously more concentrated and obvious during the Shermer years. We were just running inside zone basically every play. But even during the Garrett years, we got so accustomed to not so much of a diverse run game. And you could see not only was the Giants run game so diverse last year in their first season with Dable and Bobby Johnson, it evolved throughout the season. I remember you talked off podcast about the game against the Colts where they were using, they moved the H-back, they moved Bellinger into the backfield just to cut DeForest Buckner every play, take him out of the play, make sure get their best interior guy, the guy who could blow up every single play, is taken out of the play. And that leads me to believe that they're going to look along the lines of a center prospect who they feel can play in a multitude of different ways and can be, used in power gap, used in outside zone, like you said, in that fold technique, and just all of the different things that you can expect a center to do. Basically, an athletic center is really where I'm looking at there.
Somebody who can move, somebody who's controlled in space, somebody who can locate, and also somebody who can execute combo blocks and double teams, which you would imagine a lot of the top centers in this class can do. Because the Giants are going to run duo, right? They're going to run duo. They're going to get hip to hip. They're going to drive up to the second level. They're going to run inside zone. They're going to run I know those two schemes are very similar. With just a little note, I don't know if I ever said this on the podcast, but I think it's appropriate to delineate the differences between inside zone and duo, because it's hard to really locate what those differences are. One way to try and tell the differences, and it's still, I don't even know if it's always 100% of a hit, but one way I try to tell is on inside zone, the offensive line blocks to their play side. They're responsible for their play side gap. So they're all going to be stepping to the play side gap. That is a zone blocking scheme. On duo, you're more responsible for your backside gap. Essentially is going to isolate that tight end against the end man on the line of scrimmage, which means if you want to effectively run duo, you need a tight end who can hold up the point of attack and lose slow enough against an end man on the line of scrimmage, which is typically a 250, 260, 270 pound, depending on the defense that you're going up against. So you'll see a lot of duo runs where that tight end is isolated in a one-on-one block and everybody else is stepping to the backside as a quarterback opens up towards the tight end side, and it looks like the ball is going towards the tight end. So those are just some ways that I can differentiate between inside zone and duo. There are a lot of other rules. I'm not going to get into the sticky wickets of it because it's hard to articulate and I don't even know all of them just offhand, but those are some of the ways I can tell the difference. The Giants ran duo. The Giants run inside zone. Giants run outside zone. Giants run a ton of power gap. Like they started the season, like I said a little earlier, ton of power gap, and then they evolved with their offense and they started running a lot of zone read, incorporating Daniel Jones on quarterback power type of concept. They ran bash concepts with the back going away. A-gap power. They were running a lot of different unique things. I don't think this offense with Bobby Johnson and Brian Dable, they have like this is what we run type of mentality. Because if you pay attention to Brian Dable, going back to his days at Alabama, a lot of power gap, started transitioning to zone a little bit, gets to the Buffalo Bills, a lot of power gap. This is even as recent as 2021, a lot of power gap. You know what? We're not really having that much success. Let's start running zone because Devin Singletary is a little better in a zone type of system. They started running zone towards the end of that season in 2021. I think with this coaching staff, Dan, the sky's the limit with the rushing attack. And as you said, they're just looking for someone who can handle a lot of different responsibilities and who can do all of that. And I think John-Michael Schmitz, although he does not have so much experience in power gap, I think he has the traits to be able to hold up because he is strong at the point of attack. He has quick feet. He's a very controlled player in space and he can hold those down blocks. Like that's easy, right? When you're just pinning, but can he pull? I feel like he has the type of control to pull into space, to locate, to drive his feet onto contact, has the aiming point, seems like a very smart player. So I like his prospects of fitting into a more power gap scheme if the Giants do choose to run power gap.
And that's interesting because we assume that they will continue to run a lot of power gap, the Giants, especially after re-signing Saquon Barkley. He obviously had a lot more success, I felt like, this year in more of a power gap scheme. We always felt like that would be the case with him. We said that dating back all the way to the Shermer years based on his Penn State film. And a player like John-Michael Schmitz, like you said, there is a bit of projection going on there because he didn't do it as much. I don't find him to be the greatest athlete. I think that makes it but like you said, the film tells the story and you've seen a lot of film on him and you believe he can be that player at the next level. And that's something they're going to project as well. I think his whole profile is kind of interesting to me in the sense that, like you said, he's already 24 years old, which the Giants last offseason at least decided not to invest in older players, with the exception of DJ Davidson, who they kind of just felt would be like a plug and play interior guy. They weren't as worried as much about his age or his upside. DJ Davidson was a 5th round pick. John-Michael Schmitz would be, in this case, a 1st round pick. That's a big difference. When you're investing in a 24-year-old or whatever it is in the 5th round, you're not really worried as much about ceiling. In the 1st round, you're definitely focused on ceiling. He was also a former 3-star recruit. I don't like to go crazy about recruit stuff, but I do like to believe in the 5-star recruits. I always like to find value in the 5-star recruits that have bad college careers because they didn't fit the system, or there was competition, or whatever the reasons were, and then they end up breaking out. A great example of that I always felt was Stephon Diggs, who was one of the top recruit prospects out of that, in that class, the wide receiver position. Didn't have a good Maryland career at all. It didn't work out. The system wasn't a fit. There was no good bad quarterback play. He ends up being one of the better receivers in the NFL. I believe it was like a 2nd round pick, Stephon Diggs. So that also is part of the profile that it at least has me intrigued with John-Michael Schmitz. Like, former 3-star recruit, 24 years old, doesn't have that much experience in power gap, but there was also a lot to like about him. He was Pro Football Focus's highest graded center, or highest graded offensive lineman, I think, in all of college football. Great run blocking grade there. So immediately somebody, like you said, it maybe the projection comes from the power gap run stuff, but with outside zone, with inside zone duo, things like that, you can expect him at the next level to be a pretty good player there in the run game. So also pretty good stats. I'm just looking at it right now as a pass blocker, at least according to Pro Football Focus. So get into some of your evaluation from film on John-Michael Schmitz and some of the things you like about his game. We'll get into the concerns after that, but start with some of the things you like a lot about his game.
His feet, his hands, his eyes, they all work in unison, which allows him to maximize the power at the point of attack. And I feel like he does all this with excellent timing, right? Like he knows how to attack. I feel like for a bigger guy, I mean, he's 6'3", so he's not like 6'6" center like a Joe Tippmann. I feel like he plays with a solid pad level. He's not somebody who is going to allow his pad level to rise too much. He explodes low to high. This is somebody who has a wrestling background as well. So leverage is definitely on his side. Tight, quick, and effective ability to initiate contact. He keeps those elbows tight, those hands tight. He's a solid, technically sound type of blocker in terms of landing that punch and framing that block. And by framing that block, I mean keeping himself between the desired gap or the running back and the defender. He's able to do that really well. And I love how he's just a sturdy player at the point of attack. But we brought up outside zone. We brought up inside zone. He can reach block, man. That's something I love about him. He has an elite ability to cover ground in a reach block. And a reach block is a key block on outside zone type of concepts. When you're a center, and if you can get to the play side 2Y technique or even the 3 technique, get to their outside shoulder, swivel your hips around that player and seal him from the play side, that's invaluable. That is a very, very important trait for outside zone teams. The Giants aren't an outside zone team, but if they have a center who can do that effectively, they will incorporate outside zone concepts. Because as we said, we saw Bobby Johnson and Brian Dable be very diverse with the rushing attack to where they were using wham and trap down the stretch of the season at a pretty high clip, double trap, which was pretty awesome as well. And he's also somebody who has great range at the second level. So if you're talking about those duo blocks, inside zone blocks, where you are on the combo, he gets to the hip. He steps hip to hip with his guard, makes contact on that one technique or whoever it is, and then if he's the guy to climb, he locates and then he gets right up to the second level, cuts off the angle to the mic and the will, and he has the location ability to get onto the lap of that player, which can spring some nice runs and then force that alley defender, that safety, to be in a spot where it's him against Saquon Barkley if this guy is the center. So that's another aspect of his game that I also appreciate.
Let me ask you a couple questions, and I'll probably ask you this about all the centers we're going to discuss today. And remember, this is John-Michael Schmitz, the center out of Minnesota, who we're discussing now, widely viewed as the center one in this class. A lot of Giants fans want him at 25 overall. And we're going to talk about Joe Tippmann, the center out of Wisconsin. And we're going to talk about Luke Wypler, the center out of Ohio State. But right now we're talking John-Michael Schmitz. I'm going to ask you this question on all these players because it comes to my mind when I think offensive linemen. And it'll be a series of questions. The first one I'm going to ask you is this. How is he in dealing with stunts and twists up front in different games that defensive line play? Because this has been an issue at times in the past with some of the Giants' high draft picks. Will Hernandez is a great example of this, a player they took at 34 overall, pretty similar range to what we were taking at 25 here. And he was a player who I felt like struggled dealing with twists and stunts up front. They've had other issues with other offensive linemen over the years, more in the later years than recently. They did a pretty good job of it last year, surprisingly, considering how bad it's been over the years for the Giants dealing with twists and stunts. But how did you feel like John-Michael Schmitz's film-wise when he had to deal with twists and stunts? Was the communication good between him and his guards? Did he pick them up, or did he have issues there?
Yeah, I have this down in my notes right here. Smart player with active eyes, did a great job handling twists into the A gap is how I labeled that. And that's where he is. He's not in the B gap at all. So going through his film, I watched him maybe a month, 2 months ago. I didn't see anything glaring in terms of his inability to pick up stunts. And there are times on film, and we'll get into this with Luke Wypler, where twists and stunts were ran at him, and he didn't do an excellent job picking them up. But if you look towards the other side, it seemed like the guard was over there with one guy blocking absolutely nobody. And I'm wondering if that was a miscommunication. This is Wypler I'm talking about, between him and the guard, to where he thought the guard was going to be there. So it's like, how much do you weigh that as a negative for the center? Is the center even setting protections, or is it the quarterback? I'm not really 100% certain. So with John-Michael Schmitz specifically, I didn't see too much of that throughout his film. There might be like 1 or 2 plays here or there, but it didn't seem like a glaring issue. It seems like Will Hernandez has left such a bad taste in so many New York Giant fans' mouths that's always like the number one thing that we're discussing, where we didn't even bring up yet his ability to pass protect. We went right to the twists and the stunts. We haven't even mentioned how he is in pass protection.
Yeah, because it's just amazing to go that long as fans and see so much offensive line play. That was just what we can't pick up a simple twist and stunt. Like there were plays that were just blown dead at the line, like right at the snap during the Eli years, just because they couldn't pick up a twist and a stunt. I remember the Cowboys used to just destroy the Giants with that in the latter Eli years. Next question I want to ask you about, Nick, is two things that always stood out to me when I watched Nick Gates before his injury when he played center for the Giants. One, how is John-Michael Schmitz when it comes to communication with the rest of his offensive linemen and helping out? Like, is he always looking for work? Is he that kind of center? And then two, so he's done. So I read, just to recap what we've already done. Nick already said he's pretty good with, I would say you had him as well above average with active eyes and picking up stunts. Always looking for work is another thing you'd say about him. And then another thing I always noticed with Nick Gates that I appreciated was how aggressively he would finish blocks. He had that mean streak to him, Nick Gates. And is that something you see with a player like John-Michael Schmitz? Does he have that mean streak? Is he always trying to finish a block?
The last note in his positive section is aggressively finishes blocks, true offensive lineman type of mentality. And we also saw that at the Reese's Senior Bowl, which is where a lot of people started kind of associating John-Michael Schmitz with the New York Giants. But I kind of want to talk also, man, about his pass protection and also just his feet, because as a run blocker in a zone blocking scheme, really any blocking scheme, you need to have very precise feet. And that's something I saw with John-Michael Schmitz. He had precision in his feet, weren't really any wasted steps or missteps, took the correct angle. All those things are very important. I brought up how his feet, his hands, and his eyes all worked in unison. We bring that up with a lot of different positions. Like we bring it up with cornerbacks, right? Cornerbacks and press. You need your feet, your hands, and your eyes all to work in unison. You don't always see that. Cornerbacking, you're isolated on an island, is a little bit difficult. But in terms of offensive linemen, it's the same thing. And I felt John-Michael Schmitz did that. But in terms of his pass protection, look, he has a good anchor. He has that ability to absorb contact. I feel like he stays in front of the defender and just moves his feet. His feet are quick. They're light. He's not stressing. It's not strenuous whatsoever. He's an engaged pass protector, reacts very well. Like I said a little bit before, in pass protection, he trusts his anchor, his positioning, his technique. I feel like he had pretty solid hands as well with that technique. Like I said before, everything is nice and tight. There were a couple plays that stuck out to me where he just lost the rep. There weren't that many, honestly, in terms of pass protection. But there was one play against Nebraska where a one technique flared out into the guard and John-Michael Schmitz opened up with him. And then the one technique worked back inside and landed his forearm underneath John-Michael Schmitz's armpit and just lifted him up and kind of used a hump move a little bit to work back inside. Absolutely created separation against John-Michael Schmitz there. And then there was another play similar in the second quarter on a 2nd and 10 against Michigan State where that same thing happened. I don't think that's a glaring issue, though. Like you're going to lose one-on-one matchups sometimes against centers. Or against anything, right? Like you're not going to win 100% of the time. And I just felt like there weren't that many issues throughout his tape. And if we look at his pass blocking, this is somebody who didn't really surrender all that many pressures. He had 8 pressures this year. And then Pro Football Focus had him having 2 sacks surrendered throughout his entire time in college. Like he only allowed 21 pressures his entire time in college, where he played, I'm going to say 4 years, even though it has 2018 down there, but the guy played 1 pass blocking snap in 2018. I'm not counting that. So 21 pressures through 4 years playing significant snaps is pretty solid, right? So like, that's kind of where I'm at with John-Michael Schmitz. I just feel like he is a high floor type of player. Might not be the flashiest, might not be the sexiest, but he's still a high floor type of player.
I completely agree. I think he is the highest floor center in this class and a very high floor player overall. Probably deserves center 1 overall. He's not the center I would take 1 overall. Also, I just wouldn't take any of these centers in the top 30 personally, but he's definitely the highest floor. And I ask you next about, because this is always something that could really kill you at the NFL level, I feel like, if you don't have it. And I want to ask you about how you project this, not about how it was on film at college. So this is going to be more of a projection question for you, Nick, because again, I just always like to look at the projection, because the guys that these people are playing against are not going to be playing in the NFL for the most part. Like in the Big Ten, yeah, and the defensive line, you might find some players, but for the most part, you're looking at guys who are just not even making the back end of these NFL rosters. So how do you feel about his anchor in pass protection specifically, right? Like, is he able to anchor down, and does he lose ground there? Is he able to get bull rush back? Or is this something that he does a really good job of?
I like his anchor. I do. Now, I brought up those 2 plays where he kind of, like the club and the hump move, kind of created separation. The worst play I saw in pass protection on tape, it wasn't an anchor issue, but it was against Illinois of all teams, the defensive tackle at Illinois in the first quarter, where the defensive tackle engaged him and just used a double swipe where he grabbed cloth and just threw him to the side. And I was like, what the hell? And I think this was one of the first games I watched where I was like, why is everyone talking about John-Michael Schmitz in this manner? But that was the only play in 2022 that I saw that was like that. So a one-off type of situation.
Right.
But in terms of I'm going to bull rush through you, no, I didn't see a lot of plays where defensive linemen were bull rushing through John-Michael Schmitz. Again, when they attempt to work towards his half man, he does a good job staying in front. He moves his feet and shifts with that player's momentum, understands leverage, understands momentum. Whereas Luke Wypler, who we'll get into, the kid from Ohio State, plays with some of the best leverage in this class, but there were times where people would work to his half man, and you would see Wypler not move his feet like a player as John-Michael Schmitz did. So you would see him allow the defender to get to his half man, and then he kind of just lets him, okay, now he lost the rep. Like I saw Wypler do that, whereas John-Michael Schmitz didn't see too much plays like that, too many plays like that, I should say.
Yeah. All right, let's wrap up John-Michael Schmitz with a few things here. I want to start by talking about, or I'll ask you a couple questions and I want you to break down your overall summary on John-Michael Schmitz, and you could do that for all three of these centers, your film summary for these guys. So the first thing I want to ask is, we heard Ben Bredesen talk on Jordan Rodden's podcast about how a lot of what they do here with the Giants, Bobby Johnson and Brian Dable, is they want to get these interior line, offensive linemen cross-trained. So at any point in any time, they could play any of the three positions, center, left guard, or right guard. Projection wise, do you feel like John-Michael Schmitz can fit this billing as an interior offensive lineman who you would be comfortable putting in all three spots, or is he more of a center only type prospect?
I think he is more of a center only type of prospect right now. I mean, that's the only experience that he has. You could say it's a knock. It's a little bit more of a reality. Like, I mean, he just doesn't have much tape at any other position. So I'm going to say center is his spot. If you're drafting him, you're drafting him to play center, not necessarily right guard or left guard. Can he be cross-trained to do so? Sure, you can say that, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah, especially with a player of his. He's not a huge player, 6'3". I don't know, 6'3", 300 pounds, probably will play at the NFL level. I don't know necessarily if he's playing guard out of those two spots. Maybe. I don't know about in this system though. Okay. Next thing I would ask you then would be, is this a player that you want the Giants to take at 25? Is he atop your wish list, or two, would feel comfortable with taking at 25, or three, wouldn't want to use the 25th overall pick on?
I wouldn't necessarily want to use a 25th pick overall on him. I've said this before, and I maintain it. If they did, I'll be like, okay, so they really think getting a center is a vital part to fixing this offense and to allowing them to do what they want to do from a rushing standpoint. So I understand it. I would justify it. I wouldn't hate it, but I'm not going to sit here and say like, yes, we got to get this guy at 25. Like, it doesn't seem like centers are being drafted that high. Like, I look at the past centers and past class, like Tyler Linderbaum, much better player than John-Michael Schmitz, in my opinion. And I get he was really light in the pants. If you want to talk about just a technically sound guy who was a much better athlete, Tyler Linderbaum last year is a much better athlete than a John-Michael Schmitz. Creed Humphrey, I don't know how, but he fell all the way to like pick in the 50s or something, or maybe even the 60s. It was deep down there to Kansas City in the second round. Really? Like, I liked Creed Humphrey better than John-Michael Schmitz. So I don't think he's to that level. At the same time, this draft class isn't really a draft class where I think I don't think it's as deep as a lot of these other draft classes that we've gone over. I think I'm going to have a lot of second and third.
Kind of a shitty draft class, to be completely honest with you. Just looking at it overall, it kind of is a shitty draft class, if we're going to be honest about it. It's a good corner class, I feel like. I'm just talking at the top, by the way, not depth standpoint. Just like your top end blue chips at each position. Not great centers, in my opinion. Tackles, this is not a great tackle class. Amazing tight end class at the top. Amazing corner class at the top, I feel like. Not an amazing safety class, not an amazing wide receiver. I'm just top end guys. Running backs, whatever. You could say it's an amazing top end wide running back class just because of Bijan alone. But, across the board, I don't feel like this is that great, that talented of a class at the top.
I know what you mean, man. It's not. It's really not. And the quarterbacks are going to make it really interesting, because this could be a huge quarterback draft class if a Richardson hits, and then Levis is a little bit more, I think, of a project, a little bit more developmental from what I've seen. I saw a lot of 2021 Levis, so I was like, man, this guy can sling. Haven't watched much Kentucky. this season, but I know there seems to be a narrative, and I'm sure it's actually true, that he's had a downward turn. But damn, that guy looks not like a quarterback. Posting pictures of him, it looks like a dude that some frat boy or something. He's gigantic.
Yeah, he's jacked up. I mean, he used to play. I think not he used to play. When he was at Penn State, he was like he would catch the snap and run from the gun. Almost, that felt like he was like one of those like running type. He reminds me a lot of Taysom Hill. I don't know. You talked about his 21 tape. He was slinging it, dude. But I also felt like when I watched Wandale to scout him for the Giants, I wasn't really impressed with Will Levis. I thought he hung a lot of balls up there in the deep half. I didn't think his arm was personally as amazing as advertised. And he's like, what for me with Levis, it's like, just a simple eye test thing. Like I've seen a few games, and that's all I need to know to be like, I don't project this guy to be a good quarterback at the NFL level. And that could make me so wrong because you're only basing it on such a small thing. But it's like, I don't know. I don't love the Levis tape at all.
Shout out to Gary Levine. But
yeah,
does Gary listen to us, by the way?
We just had a conversation about this last night, and we don't need to talk too much about it. This is my best friend off the podcast I grew up with since I was like 5 years old. But he's like, it's so sad that you guys, that either one, I didn't grow up a Giants fan, he's a diehard Jets fan, or two, you guys weren't a Jets podcast. He's like, I'd be listening to every single one, be on a mailbag every single time. But he's a Jets fan. He's not gonna listen to a Giants podcast.
Okay, I feel that. I was going to retract it if he was a Giant fan and didn't listen to it, but I will leave it there. But the reason I bring that up is, and this is not my comp, I can't remember who I heard it from, but I felt like it was a pretty good comp for Will Levis, and we'll get back to the guards after this. Carson Wentz. And I was like,
think he has Wentz's arm talent.
I don't think that's my exact thing. I don't think he has Wentz's arm, but you want to talk about the shoddy decision making?
Yeah.
The wow, and then the
yeah,
kind of Carson Wentz like.
Every single Penn State fan you talk to, by the way, thinks this is the most ridiculous thing that he's being discussed as a first round pick. They all think he's trash, horrible. Like, I just hate when I hear like the fan base of the teams all be like, "This guy's what are you guys seeing that we're not seeing?" Like, it seems like it's all projection based, and the same can be said about Anthony Richardson. I get it, but the difference is Anthony Richardson was a 10-0 RAS score type athlete. We're talking about a totally different type of athlete and arm talent from Richardson to Levis to me. So it's like I'd rather gamble on somebody who has every high-end trait than like somebody who people say he has every high-end trait with Levis. And I watch it, I'm like, this arm talent's not that amazing. And he's not that fast as a mover either in open space. He's not really making anyone miss as a runner either. He's big and he moves. He's not Josh Allen as a runner. I know that. He's definitely not Josh Allen. He may have the size, but he's not Josh Allen in space. So I don't know. Levis is a guy I'm not going to be in on.
I know. I feel you, but I would have more work to do. But we're not even scouting quarterbacks. And I'm going to get to my John-Michael Schmitz synopsis. So before we move to Joe Tippmann. So John-Michael Schmitz is a smart, physical, efficient moving center who is an excellent run blocker with range. His ability to reach block is ideal for zone rushing teams, but he can easily play in any system due to his movement skills. Schmitz exercises good overall body control, footwork, and combo blocking ability while playing like a famished pit bull with uncooked sirloin at stake. Ha! Puns. Schmitz is a good overall pass blocker who is light on his feet. He does well in readjusting through reps to optimize his effectiveness. If I'm nitpicky, I appreciate his run blocking more than his pass blocking. Pad level is generally good, but defenders have gotten underneath him while in a half-man relationship. It's not consistent, but it's worth noting. Any team should be happy to draft a player like John-Michael Schmitz. I expect him to be a day one starter for a team. He's technically sound, has solid play strength, and can execute any block. You'll hear his name called somewhere, maybe late day one, early day two.
Okay, and that's John-Michael Schmitz. Let's move on now to Joe Tippmann, the center of Wisconsin. And look, I don't claim to be, he's, by the way, Tippmann, age 22, John-Michael Schmitz, age 24, just if that matters. Something to consider, obviously, with where the Giants drafted last year on age. He's 6'6", 313. I'm not an offensive line expert when it comes to film. I'm just trying to make projections to the next level. And when I watch him move in space versus a John-Michael Schmitz or a Wypler or anyone else that I've put on clips of or seen people break down clips of, it looks like a different type of athlete moving in space with Joe Tippmann. And that's why I'm so excited about a player like Joe Tippmann, because I want that kind of second level move, that guy who in space can just get out there on power and gap plays and just beat get so fast to the spot that Saquon Barkley, like you said, last year you saw some reps where, he had to wait and he had to be patient and wait for his Feliciano to get there. You don't have to wait. You don't have to be as patient because Tippmann or a player like that is getting out there. And with 6'6" size, I almost kind of like it. I know there haven't been that many centers at that size, but I think he has a better chance not only when he gets out there with his athleticism, but also the reach and the length that can use that to his advantage in space to kind of make plays as a weapon, as a run blocker or on screen passes in space. So Tippmann, to me, I see a much higher ceiling, I guess I would say, than a player like John-Michael Schmitz. That's probably where my blind spot is because John-Michael Schmitz is, like you said, so efficient and so technically sound that it oftentimes doesn't flash to you on tape.
I think that's a pretty good analysis of the two players. But I got to ask you, how do you feel about the mullet? You don't seem like a mullet guy to me, but this is your mullet. This is a Badger mullet. So, and honestly, I don't know why, but I feel like Wisconsin offensive linemen should have mullets. So he really lives.
I can get behind an offensive lineman with a mullet. I feel like you really have to fit a bill to be you have to fit into a bucket to be a guy who wears a mullet. I wouldn't wear a mullet. You wouldn't wear a mullet, but an offensive lineman, he can wear a mullet. And one other thing that I wanted to
mullet would look like. I have no idea if I would have a mullet, what that would look like with my hair.
Yes, yeah. You wouldn't look Italian anymore. Not that you really do to begin with, but another thing I like about Joe Tippmann, just looking at his profile versus a player like John-Michael Schmitz or Luke Wypler is Joe Tippmann made Bruce Feldman's freak list, his 2022 freak list. That shows off some of the most explosive. Feldman puts out a list of people who he thinks are the most explosive athletes. And this to me is a good way to kind of project to the next level. Because again, I always like to say this and come back to this, but to me, it's really important. What these guys do at the collegiate level is worth a lot, but it's not worth to me more. Like, I'll try to frame this in a better way, Nick. I'm more concerned with the projection than I am with how they did at the college level. I'm going to be brutally honest because they're just playing none of the same guys they're playing at the NFL level. The people who you match up against the NFL are the best of the best from college football. You'll maybe get one guy all year you're going to match up with at college level you're matching up with at the NFL level. That's equal to or better than the NFL level. And some of these guys aren't even close. Some of these defensive linemen that these centers are playing against at the collegiate level are just terrible players that will never even make an NFL roster. So I look at things like projection, and he made his freak list because let me see what it was here. He squatted 635 pounds, Joe Tippmann, which is an insane number, right? Benches 455 pounds. Ran a short shuttle in 4.31 seconds, which Feldman says would have been the fastest time for an offensive lineman at the combine. He didn't run the combine, Tippmann. He didn't test the combine. And it says if that number, which was recorded for the 2022 season, is accurate, that was actually you, Nick, who wrote this, then it would be the fourth best time by an offensive lineman ever in combine history. Any offensive lineman. And according to Bruce Feldman, he also reportedly ran a 1.65 10-yard split, which is almost in the receiver range of absurdness. Like, you're talking about some of the bigger receivers are probably running a 10-yard split like that. So this is what it comes down to for me, Nick. It's like I can have a John-Michael Schmitz and I can get the technically sound aspect and I can get the guy who looks better on film right now at Minnesota, or I can get the guy like Joe Tippmann who's 6'6", 313 pounds. When you watch him, even for a second, he looks like he's moving like a tight end. Squatted 635, bench 455, ran a 10-yard split like a receiver, ran what was it? The short shuttle, which people say is the only important drill for projecting offensive linemen, ran at fourth best time ever. And I'm just looking at that and I'm just like, I would rather have that.
Yeah, those were all two before the 2022 season when Bruce Feldman posted those testing numbers, and Nicky Research ended up kind of compiling that and kind of cross-checking what combine history was. And yeah, that would be the fourth best. If those are accurate, again, the combine might measure them a little bit differently. They could be favorable, but regardless of that, this guy is a freaking freak athlete. So if you want to talk about floor and ceiling, upside, things like that, Joe Tippmann has a much higher ceiling than a player like John-Michael Schmitz because of that athletic ability. And when you watch Joe Tippmann, there are a lot of technical issues. He is not nearly as refined as John-Michael Schmitz, but he's also just turned 22 years old. This is a young player. He's a redshirt junior, and he started, 33 games at center for Wisconsin. This is a player who still has a lot of college tape under his belt, but it's plausible that he can refine his technique at the next level once he receives that coaching, and he can improve on a lot of the technical issues that I don't even want to say plagued him, but that were just evident on his film. And if he's able to refine those and able to correct some of those technical flaws that we're about to go through, then he is going to be a better player than a John-Michael Schmitz because of that athletic ability. Like John-Michael Schmitz, he can redirect his weight and reshift his weight well to pick up those twists, to get to different types of blocks. But Joe Tippmann, in terms of his change of direction and short area quickness, can do that at a more precise rate. And when you have that type of high upside, that type of athletic ability, I think the sky is the limit for you if you receive good coaching and you're coachable. And there's nothing in his profile that suggests to me that he's not a coachable player.
Yeah, and that's why people say, like, you look at the thing, like, some people are discussing the short shuttle, which we talked about before, for best time of any offensive lineman at the combine, whatever. Amazing numbers for Tippmann in the short shuttle. People say, like, this is the one thing you want to look at for offensive linemen from a testing standpoint, because they're looking at the data, and the data shows that the players who have had these amazing short shuttles, with the exception of basically just Andre Dillard and no one else, have all found success at the NFL level. And some of the best offensive linemen are on that list. Terran Armstead is on that list. Like, these people who are just able to change directions fast and have the ability to move and flip your hips and do things like that Tippmann can do. And I think about it like this, Nick. I'm like, when I'm projecting these guys to the NFL level, I'm like, all the things we discussed about with John-Michael Schmitz versus Joe Tippmann so far, all the technical issues Tippmann has, those can probably be fixed. And if not, at least have a chance to be fixed by good coaching. Would you agree with that? And not just good coaching. Obviously, the player has to commit to the coaching and learning and fixing and changing his habits. But those things with the right coaching and the right player can be changed, correct?
I would say yes, specifically in terms of his hands, because they can be a little bit slow to engage. He has a very large surface area because he's 6'6". And when you're slow to engage your hands, you're not protecting your chest. And those smaller defensive linemen or even bigger defensive linemen can get up into your chest and then control you, which was an issue sometimes with Joe Tippmann in pass protection. So I would say I would like for his hands to be a little bit quicker. I feel like his hands and his elbows aren't always tight when engaging contact, when initiating contact. They can come a little wide sometimes, and then you can kind of get into that little bear hug type thing. I think he was penalized like 6 times or something in 2022, which isn't a huge issue, but it's still something. I think the center of gravity could be an issue because he is 6'6". He could maintain a lower center of gravity, which is always great in terms of playing the offensive line. And I also think the high nature, and Giant fans are going to hate to hear this, did lead to some balance issues. I don't think it was as clear as Evan Neal at Alabama, because we discussed, man, we liked Evan Neal a lot. I still like Evan Neal a lot, but it wasn't a shock that he struggled as much as he did in his rookie season. We said as much. We said, dude, he's going to struggle. He's going to have speed bumps early on in his career, but we expect him, because he is such a conscientious individual, to develop, because he has all the athletic traits, length, and everything you want to be an offensive tackle. But what was the primary reason why we were thinking that he was going to struggle coming from college to the NFL? Was those balance issues. And Tippmann, I don't think it's as glaring, but it is something that I felt like was worth noting. So you're talking about balance, engagement of hands, fitting your hands inside, and maintaining a lower center of gravity and a low hat because you are 6'6". Those are issues that I think he'll have to kind of rectify, I guess, or at least work on mitigating. Another thing is kind of sustaining blocks, because he is late with his hands and because he's not, I would say, the best at fitting his hands inside. There were times where he couldn't sustain his blocks. He's big, right? And he's a great mover, so he can stay in front of you. But if you don't have control of that chest, if you don't get into that breastplate or really just gain any sort of control in that defensive line, you're just kind of mirroring the player, right, from side to side. And if that player is powerful or strong, they can create that separation and work around you. It's not something that I feel like was prevalent throughout his tape, but these are issues that are going to crop up more in the NFL if you saw these slight issues in college.
For sure. And I asked the question because, well, first, let me say this. My 2 biggest concerns with Joe Tippmann by far and away, just from watching enough interior offensive line play with you over the years, watching Giants tape, is how important is that he doesn't have the leverage on every play. I'm a big believer in the leverage on those like tight spaces in the interior offensive line. We saw Dalvin Tomlinson really a lot of what, in my opinion, Dalvin Tomlinson does well is just win that leverage battle over and over and over again. But it doesn't mean it's not a be all end all, right? We've also seen Dexter Lawrence dominate against the center as a 6'5" guy. So there are different ways to do it. And then the second thing is the balance issues, which I think I've seen as well. And that's whenever you're talking about these long 6'6", 6'7" offensive linemen, you always have to be concerned with that. But I've asked you the question because I wanted to say, Nick, all the things you bring up all fit into the billing of technical issues that, with the right coaching and the right player who has obviously the right mindset, you need to make sure he's dedicated to, wants to be the best center, wants to be the best whatever position he plays, Those are things that you can improve on. But all the things we talked about before that Joe Tippmann has that John-Michael Schmitz doesn't have, that insane short shuttle change of direction, that insane ability to, I'm sure that John-Michael Schmitz can also squat a crazy amount, but does he squat 635 pounds and bench 455? Does he have a 165 10-yard split? None of those things can be taught for John-Michael Schmitz. Those are just part of his athletic profile that won't change no matter what. And that's why for me, I always come back to, I'm always a ceiling guy when it comes to the draft, and I'm always a projection guy, because I want the guys who have the stuff you can't teach that you then can teach. And you always got to nail the right guy, right? You have to find the guy who is going to take well to coaching. Some of these guys won't. Eric Flowers had traits, but he never took well to coaching, and he could never change who he was. So you're going to have misses there too, but you need to do a good job in those situations of weeding out who those misses could be, right? If they had taken more time with Eric Flowers, they would have known he's the type of guy who could push a reporter in a locker room after a playoff game when he's angry, like he did with Jordan Ronan, or, all of the things he did from a character standpoint that were questionable and not great, and showed you, all right, maybe this isn't a guy who's going to reframe his whole way of blocking with the right coaching, right? But if you have the opposite guy, a guy, and I'm not saying Tippmann is this guy, I have no idea who he is as a person. The Giants, that's their job to do. But let's say Tippmann is a guy who will take well to coaching, Nick, and he is the type of guy who can change his whole profile and fix all these issues. Now you have a guy who has all those athletic traits, and you unlock him and you turn him into such a better player that I'm not so sure the guys who don't have these insane athleticism can actually be, because I feel like they're almost in a lot of ways capped out.
Yes. And just to your point about him as a person, no way I can tell that, but we can get into his brain and how he operates on the football field. And he seems like a very smart player. Like I had in my notes, this guy is never fooled. I think the whole balance issue might be, or not balance issue, but the center of gravity issue could be difficult to rectify, but that doesn't mean he won't be an effective player at the next level. Because you're right, man. That athletic ability, that trumps anything that John-Michael Schmitz has. Because when you watch, and Wisconsin pulls a lot, they pulled their center a lot. Watch him pull so quick, so fast. He gets to that end man on the line of scrimmage or that safety coming down, and he swivels his hips. And by the time the running back is entering the hole, his ass is to the running back. You want to talk about movement skills. You want to talk about if the Giants want to still incorporate those power gap concepts. Yeah, John-Michael Schmitz might be able to do it. A little bit of a projection. Joe Tippmann is not a projection whatsoever. Right. He can execute that. If you need the range from your center to get outside of the hash, to get towards the numbers, to pick up a cornerback, to pick up a linebacker scraping over the top, Joe Tippmann is your guy. And that's some of the stuff I love about him as a run blocker. I think he's also a good pass protector too.
And what did the Giants find? I want to ask you this, Nick, before you go into that. What did the Giants find the most success with in their run game last year?
Oh, it's power gap.
The exact thing you just broke down, which he'll be good at. So something to think about.
Yes, and I would encourage anybody to go over to Giants Country. Just type in Nick Filato, Joe Tippmann on Google, and you can find my detailed analysis on his strengths and his weaknesses. I'll give my synopsis here in a little bit, but this is somebody who has the feet, has the movement skills, has the athletic ability, has the hips, has the ability to redirect his weight, handled counter moves well. He's a big, thick hands. When he does land them, he has that good grip strength. He just doesn't land them consistently enough. Showed an elite ability to absorb contact with excellent ankle flexion. That's important, man, because when you're 6'6", your chest is exposed. You're going to be high. You have to be able to go up against an Aaron Donald or just a smaller defensive lineman. Aaron Donald's going to probably toss him aside, but Aaron Donald tosses everybody aside. So you need to go up against a smaller defensive lineman who can get into your chest and who's trying to bull rush you and who's going to win that pad level battle. You need to be able to just anchor down. Your back might get bowed back a little bit, but if you can just keep your feet planted in the ground and just kind of walk back, that power as he's exploding low to high and you're just absorbing it. That's something that Joe Tippmann showed. This is somebody who only gave up 9 pressures in college. So pass protection is his thing, despite the fact that he has some balance issues, which was more about sustaining blocks in the run game when it wasn't pulling into space. Okay. So that's one reason why I'm very high on Joe Tippmann. I don't know if I would want him in the first round, but more so if he's available on day 2. I would be excited to land a player like that, depending on who else is on the board. Obviously, there's definitely stuff to iron out, which I'll get into in a little bit when I give my synopsis, but there is a ton of upside with this player. You want to talk about upside floor? John-Michael Schmitz, that's a floor play right there. Is he going to be good? Yes. Joe Tippmann, that's an upside play. Is he going to be bad? I don't think so. I still think he'll be a functional starter, even if he doesn't iron out the slight concerns we have with his profile.
Yeah, I feel the same way. All right, let's do it now. Let's give a quick summary for Joe Tippmann, and then we'll move on to Luke Wypler, and then we'll get into some bigger discussions like where we want to take these players. And I'm going to ask you something else, which I don't want to spoil now, but I know you're not going to love the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But first, you can dive into his synopsis real quick.
One more thing I just wanted to mention before I get
Sure.
into synopsis, just because we brought this up with John-Michael Schmitz. This is a player who loves the finish. I have in his profile, send him to IHOP because he loves pancakes. So that's something that you have to bring up, elite competitor. But for the synopsis, I have this.
Oh, wait. I want to get to all the questions. I promised I would do it. So let's do it real quick. How did you see, how did he look to you against stunts and twists up front?
I have in my notes that he was a very smart player, and the fact that he can redistribute his weight and open his hips the way he does leads me to believe that he is very good at picking up the stunts. I didn't see any issues with picking up stunts. I mean, again, he gave up like 5 pressures last year.
Yeah, nothing there. And then on the Nick Gates factor, is he always looking for work as a center? Is he finishing blocks? Is he has a nasty streak to him?
Oh yeah, very nasty streak. Very nasty guy.
Okay, very nasty guy. All right, we're going to move on to your quick synopsis, and then we'll get into some Luke Wypler.
Joe Tippmann thrives kicking into space and power gap concepts where he can utilize his location skills, body control on the move, and overall impressive athletic traits to kick out or lead block. He's a good overall run blocker who can improve his hand timing, placement, and engagement, but few interior offensive linemen of his gigantic size can move like Tippmann. He could also block zone and duo due to his combo and climb success. He does tend to get a little over his skis when engaged laterally against shorter, more stout defenders. Tippmann finishes blocks with authority, and he does well in pass protection. His feet are quick, he handles counter moves solidly, and his anchor is excellent. Tippmann absorbs contact and sits back on his hips, showing an ability to keep the pocket intact. His pad level led to balance problems, and he wasn't always the best at sustaining blocks, despite having impressive grip strength. He has to find a way to leverage his hand usage in a more efficient and precise manner. Tippmann should be a starter early in his career, and fans of the team that selects him will love him with or without the mullet.
I love it. All right, that was Joe Tippmann, the center out of Wisconsin. We broke down so far Tippmann. We broke down John-Michael Schmitz. Now let's get into Luke Wypler, another guy who is also in the mix for top center in this class. John-Michael Schmitz, Luke Wypler, and Joe Tippmann are the ones that are most discussed. He's 21 years old, the youngest of the three, 6'3", 303 pounds. Excuse me. Solid testing numbers, a 7.643 cone, pretty good. Short shuttle 4.53, not quite as good as the Joe Tippmann stats. And then 29 bench press reps, also pretty good, but all pretty good numbers. The 10-yard split was 1.83. Again, not quite Joe Tippmann level athleticism, really not far off if those reported numbers are true, pretty far off, but still a very good athlete from relative to the rest of the centers. So let's get into some Luke Wypler tape now, and let me know what you saw.
Yeah, this is somebody who has good size, a nice thick frame. He is from Montvale, New Jersey, ended up going to the same high school as the McCourty twins, which was St. Joseph's Regional High in Montvale. I have good overall athlete, has good range, executed a lot of fold blocks. Not really a power gap team over there at Ohio State, but a player who, again, folded. So that shows your ability to kick into space. And I felt like he did that at a solid rate. I felt like him kicking into space is something that he can do sufficiently at the NFL level. I don't think he moves quite like Joe Tippmann. I'm dubious that he moves quite as well as John-Michael Schmitz, but I don't think he's a stone out there. I think he will be a solid overall athlete in terms of getting out in space. And one thing I love the most about him is he does get out of his stance quickly, but it's how he plays with leverage. He's a wrestler, right? And you could see it on his
I was
tape.
just going to say, I love the Tristan Wirfs part of his profile. The Tristan Wirfs was a, all-state wrestler. And I think as an offensive lineman, having that wrestling background is so important.
Not only does he know how to manipulate defenders and win with leverage, but it's his feet and his ability to fit his hands. Like, he's a technically proficient player. If you need him to execute a zone block, like I was talking about with John-Michael Schmitz, those feet, no wasted movement whatsoever. It's boom, boom, precise right into the block. He can get to that 2-eye technique, and get to that outside shoulder once he's flowing laterally to stop an outside zone run on the play side. So I appreciate the precise nature of his feet. I appreciate how he gets his hands inside. He does a pretty solid job keeping those hands tight, keeping those elbows tight. He's not really wild with any of those types of aspects of his game. So technically, check box. Right there. Good combo and climb ability as well. So if we're talking about a duo blocking type of play, which I felt like Ohio State ran a lot, against odd front teams like Indiana and Maryland. An odd front team means that there was a nose technique. And those teams ran a lot of Okie and Eagle fronts, which Eagle front means there's 2 4-eye and a nose, and an Okie front means there's 2 5 techniques and a nose. And against that, the Ohio State team would run a lot of duo. They would run a lot of duo. That's where you got to see more of a vertical displacement factor from Luke Wypler, whereas the outside zone nature and the inside zone nature is much more of a lateral type of play. And I felt like Wypler handled those assignments well. If he needed to displace somebody, he did a good job kind of getting underneath their pads because he has that low leverage, driving his feet into contact, uncoiling his hips into contact, quick feet, just driving through the ground. That's what he does. And he's just able to kind of lift them up and then steer them the way he needs to. But when a player worked towards his half man, like I said a little bit earlier, I didn't feel like he brought his feet as efficiently as a John-Michael Schmitz did to keep up with that angle. Eventually, that player who was working towards the half man is able to create separation. Now, he might be getting guided out of a gap. Sometimes it wasn't, because sometimes it was in pass protection. But there were times where he lost sustainability and he lost his ability to kind of control that blocker because he wasn't following him and mirroring him. Didn't think it was a huge issue, just a point of note for Luke Wypler's tape. I really loved what he was able to do against Georgia. It wasn't perfect, but he had a rep against Jalen Carter that was perfect. And it was a rep where Jalen Carter tried to use a hump move, which is I'm going to run directly at you, and I'm going to take my forearm, and I'm going to club underneath your armpit and try to lift you up and just throw you aside. Jalen Carter does that a lot. He's very explosive, very strong player, would be a top 3 pick if he didn't have his issues off the field right now. I got to say, man, Wypler did a really good job shifting his weight on that play and just kind of maintaining a low leverage and just did not cave in to the power move from Jalen Carter. It was one of the more impressive reps I've seen from any of these offensive linemen that we're going over, that specific rep against Jalen Carter. So I think there's a lot to like about Wypler, especially when we're considering him later than when we're talking about John-Michael Schmitz and Joe Tippmann.
Right. And that's a key factor in this as well. And I think, when you're looking at the overall profile, there are things that you broke down that really stood out to me. I've seen a little bit of Luke Wypler, not as much as you, obviously. But one thing that I like the most that you broke down is, does he win the leverage battle often? And is it partly because of that wrestling background? I think the answer is yes. When you're a former wrestler, you're playing the offensive line, you're almost like, it's like they talk about, what's that line? You're like a dog in a China, or what was it? A pit bull in a China shop or whatever. What's that phrase they use? Pit bull in a China shop.
Say, any kind of wild animal in a China shop.
Right. In a China shop. And you could see it with him. He's often like, utilizing his skill set there to win in those spots where you have to win with leverage, which I like. I also like what you broke down about his reps against Georgia, because to me, a big factor in projection is, how did these guys look against the actual players who are going to play in the NFL? Again, I'm big on this. I don't love going off of like, how are they looking against these shitty Big Ten people, or sometimes they play out of conference. There's guys who don't play in the NFL. Jalen Carter's playing in the NFL. And even if Jalen Carter fizzles out because of the things you discussed, Nick, or you mentioned briefly, the off-field stuff, at least he has the talent and the film of somebody who could play at the NFL level, who translates right away a player like Jalen Carter. So if he's holding his own against a player like that, that's a good sign that he could potentially hold his own against NFL players.
Absolutely. Now let's get into, first I'll mention a couple other things that I appreciated about his game. Talked about his range. I don't think it's as expansive as Joe Tippmann, but I think he does an excellent job accessing the outside shoulder of like 2 techniques. He can get out there. 2 technique is directly over the guard to the play side. That guard is going to be moving laterally, so he has to get out there, access that outside shoulder, and then seal him off from the desired rushing lane of the running back. And he has the range to do that. I talked about how he folded. He can fold well. There are times of him doing what we talked about with Joe Tippmann, where he's pulling around and he's locating the MN on the line of scrimmage, and he's getting his hips outside. So from an athletic ability standpoint, like I think I said this a little earlier, but I'll say it again. John-Michael Schmitz, Joe Tippmann. Well, Joe Tippmann's far beyond these two. I would say he's more like a John-Michael Schmitz. And I just love the technical nature, similar to John-Michael Schmitz, that Luke Wypler has. But the issues that I have that differentiate John-Michael Schmitz with Luke Wypler is the length. Now, John-Michael Schmitz has 32 3/4 inch arms. Luke Wypler has 31 5/8. So there's a difference there. He's a little bit shorter, and I feel like you can see that on tape. And it looks like his frame is probably filled out, despite the fact that he's only like 6'3", 303 pounds, which isn't all that big. It's like the same exact size as John-Michael Schmitz. I'm wondering if Michael Schmitz can add a little bit more. Not really 100% certain about that. But Luke Wypler looks like he is filled out. And it's big, thick, nice frame. But one of my issues with his tape that didn't show up all the time, but when it did, it was really obvious. It was anchor. There were times where defensive linemen got underneath him and just drove him right into CJ Stroud. Do not like that. Issue right there. Happened like maybe 3 or 4 times on tape. Because again, Luke Wypler, just like the other two, he only surrendered 8 pressures last year and 8 pressures the year before. 1 sack. We're not talking about somebody who was giving up that many pressures. But there were plays throughout his tape where I was like, oh man, I do not like to see that. His strength too, it's modest. Like he's good with angles and technique. He's not really somebody that I feel like is going to bulldoze you off the line of scrimmage. So those are some slight concerns I have with him. He had 8 penalties, I believe, in 2021. 8 penalties in 2022 and 3 penalties in 2020. And I just think that length is always going to allow defensive linemen to dictate the rep. Because if you have less than 32-inch arms, even for an interior offense, it's not a death sentence. But when you're going up against Dexter Lawrence, when you're going up against DeForest Buckner, when you're going up against Eric Armstead, and these guys who have like 34+ inch arms, it's going to put you in a disadvantageous situation. So I think it's just something that he's going to have to overcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I thought something interesting you talked about looking at these 3 prospects. I would say the only one of these 3 who has more room to grow within his frame would be Joe Tippmann, because he's 6'6", 313 pounds. And when you look at him out there, you could be like, at least when you look at him versus looking at the other 2, you could be like, there's room. You can add more to it. He could definitely add more to his frame. He could be a 6'6", 325-pound player, 6'6", 320-pound player, and it wouldn't look like he added much weight at that point. And that's something that's interesting to me too. Is there room to grow within their frame? Can they become a different level, a different size player at the next level? Which I think is possible most for, I would say, Tippmann, then John-Michael Schmitz, and as you mentioned, it almost feels like Wypler. This is what he is going to be. This is his frame. It's in a lot of ways maxed out to that extent.
It does seem so, but I'll say this, man. I think I brought up his ability to get up to the second level. I talked about angles on the line of scrimmage. I also love his angles up to the linebacker too, specifically when it's within that tackle box. I feel like he does a really good job on the duo situations when he was asked to chip and then find. So I like that about him. You ready for the synopsis, bud?
Yeah, let's do it.
Luke Wypler is a technically proficient center who understands how to manipulate defenders by accessing his leverage advantage. His background as a wrestler is evident on tape. He is a good athlete with range and has the excellent ability to locate defenders in space. His ideal fit is an outside zone blocking scheme, but I feel like he could be scheme diverse. Wypler is also good in pass protection, maintains a low center of gravity, and handled counter moves well. He did struggle with his anchor. There were snaps where he was walked back into the pocket, and that's one of the more glaring issues with his game. He's also not the longest, so initiating contact against certain defensive linemen could be an issue, but he is a smart center who should be a long-time starter in the league at the next level.
Okay, so that was Luke Wypler, the center out of Ohio State. Now let's wrap up by discussing these 3 centers as a whole. Nick, I want you to make a projection here and try to look at it less so of what you saw on tape and more so how you project what you saw on tape to be to the next level against NFL level competition. So who would you be most willing to gamble? Like, so less so ranking, in order, where would you make your gamble on these 3 centers in order?
I think it depends on what you want. I think Joe Tippmann might fit best with the New York Giants because of the upside. I think John-Michael Schmitz is a good center. He's my number 1 center in this class, but I'm also looking at this holistically from the entire NFL. But if we're talking about the Giants, I think Joe Tippmann, despite a lot of those struggles and those technical deficiencies that I feel like most of them are correctable, he could be the high upside swing that would excite me the most. Whereas John-Michael Schmitz, I think I know what I'm getting, and I think I'm going to be pleased with what I'm getting, albeit it's a little bit lackluster. It's not sexy. It's a center, right? Joe Tippmann has a little bit of sexiness to him, despite the fact that he is a center because of those movement skills and because of that upside. And you're right, man. He's 313 pounds. I think he could add a little bit of weight, right? Looks like his frame can hold a little bit. He's 6'6". He's a gigantic guy. And then Luke Wypler, that's a little bit later, right? For me, he is my center 3 right now. There's still some centers I got to watch, but he is behind these 2 because of those concerns that we discussed, the anchor, the play strength, which isn't really, I wouldn't say he's not strong, but I don't know if he's as strong as the other 2 that we've gone over. And it's really just the length and then the anchor ability, which is, a little bit of an issue for me.
Okay. So round one, would you want any of these players for the Giants?
Not really, but if I had to, like if they went with a Tippmann or John-Michael Schmitz, like I said, I think on the last podcast, or maybe it was earlier on this one, it's like, okay, they really identified center as being an issue. So they got their center. Now the Giants don't need to worry about this position that has been a huge issue for them dating back to essentially Sean O'Hara, really. Like it's been quite a while since the Giants have had a center. So that's the way I would rationalize it in my mind, but it's not the sexiest. And I would probably look at other positions and be like, oh, we could have that guy, but I don't think I would be throwing my hands in the air and being upset about it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about how it's been an issue for them, this position. I almost look at this position a little bit differently than you do, Nick, because I agree they haven't had a really, really good center since O'Hara. But out of all the positions, like the work they got out of Nick Gates, the work they got out of Feliciano even this last season, it's almost been so much closer to average than some of like the tackles who we've been dealing with through the years, or even the guards like the Will Hernandez years. Like, and that's kind of where I'm always at with center. It's why I'm not really interested ever in using a top premium pick on it, unless, of course, you see yourself like, oh, here's a Mangold. Here's Kelsey wasn't rated that high, but you can know the type of center where you're going to look at him and be like, this guy can change our whole offense, and it's such a surefire prospect evaluation. He's so good that it doesn't even matter the position. He's worth a top 10, top 15, top whatever type pick. But if you're not talking about those types of players, it's almost to me like I feel like I can get average center play from a lot of different, a wide variety of investments, whether it be back end free agency like a Feliciano pickup of recent years, undrafted free agent like Nick Gates. There's just so many different avenues for it for me. So it's kind of where I'm at with center as far as 25 to answer that question. I don't want them to take any of these centers at 25. It would be a disappointing thing for me. I'd rationalize it like, all right, at least we're improving the offensive line. At least we're investing in the thing I believe in, which is building out your trenches and finding protection for Daniel Jones and, build from the inside out, all things that I've preached and I believe in, but it doesn't mean I want to use premium assets to try to get there, at least at the center position. I'm way more open to drafting a guard at 25 than I am a center at 25 in general. Especially if, again, like I said, if it's not a center, like I think Mangold was like the 25th overall pick in that class, or like around that range, despite being such an obvious evaluation, because people were like, it's a center. We don't really take centers high. But now if you're starting to move into the conversation, guys like Wypler, Tippman, and John-Michael Schmitz, I feel like you're pushing the boundary a little bit. You're shifting the boundary. Now you're going from, we don't really want to take a center that high, but if it's a Mangold type, we can do it, to, we don't want to take a center that high, but we really need center. We're the Giants. We want to improve the offensive line. It's all about improving the offensive line, build inside out. Daniel Jones needs protection. Well, now you're just kind of going too far into the need corner for me.
It all depends on who's available. I got to ask you, what was your feeling on Travis Frederick when he came out? Because that was a pick that was maligned by a lot of people.
It was very maligned by a lot of people. And I got to be honest with you, when that pick came out, I wasn't watching any film on offensive linemen. I wasn't at that point. So I don't really know. I remember at Wisconsin, though, and this is the kind of thing I always talked about with you. I remember I talked about this with you, maybe off podcast, maybe on this podcast. But I will say this about the Travis Frederick team at Wisconsin. They were dominant at the point of attack in the run game all throughout his entire tenure there. And everyone knew they were running the football at all times, and he still wanted the point of attack so consistently. Again, I go back to John-Michael Schmitz. I go back to this past Wisconsin team with Joe Tippmann, and I go back to the Ohio State team, and none of those teams were really dominant in the run game the way that Travis Frederick centered, Travis Frederick anchored line was.
I feel you, man. And I don't view any of these centers like a Travis Frederick or like any of really these top centers, which makes 25 almost out of it for me. Like I said, I would try to find a way to rationalize it, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the Giants will go center at 25. I think this is a second round pick. If one of these guys fall, specifically John-Michael Schmitz and Joe Tippmann, I think the Giants would really entertain that in the second round. Maybe if they avoid that in the second round, Wypler in the third round. That's kind of where I'm at with the center discussion. But at 25, I don't think the Giants or Joe Schoen will entertain it personally.
Yep, I agree with you on that. And again, just like you said, in the second round, I'd be more open to it. I'm interested in it with somebody like Tippmann. I'm fine with it with somebody like John-Michael Schmitz. I'm not as high on him, but again, at that pick, round 2, I think it's a good value pick at that point. Now you've gotten into the value range. You're outside of your premium picks. Like I always like to mention, once to me, it's like when you get outside of the top 50 in this class, and honestly, Nick might be closer to like get outside the top 30 prospects, and you're taking gambles at that point on anyone who's left on the draft board. Like this is not an exciting class to me at all. I wonder if this will be the worst overall class we evaluate in doing this. Just my thought process. Again, I like some of these I like the corners. I like the corners. I like the depth at some of these positions, but the top end blue chip talent in this class, man, like even looking up top at like these tackles, dude, like we had better tackles last year's class for sure, right? Like I don't really know who I even considered. How many blue chips do you even see in a class like this? This is another conversation for another podcast, but it's just something that I consider.
I know that's a conversation for another podcast, but I would say Will Anderson, Jalen Carter,
yes,
Bijan. He's
the two
chip.
corners for sure. Bijan, but that's a running back, but fine. We can call him a blue chip. The
and
two corners, I think Gonzalez and Witherspoon.
Stroud and Young. I like CJ Stroud a lot.
Yeah, but
Bryce Young too.
The two corners, you're putting them both?
I would personally,
Any
yes.
other corners or no?
I mean, I don't know if Banks is quite there, so I'd probably have him close, but no. So yeah, it's probably that. Like right now, for the guys
there. Yeah,
there could be there could be players that like I haven't even watched who like no one's really talking about who could slide in and be that. You know what I mean? But and I haven't watched these tackles. And Tyree Wilson is somebody I've seen clips of. I haven't studied him because the Giants have no shot at him. So maybe he can develop into that. I know when you have that freak type of size, that's a good possibility that if you're used the right way, that you can develop into a freak type of athlete at the edge position. So maybe him, but I don't really know right now.
I would say it's a really good class for the Giants to be picking in the back end of, to be completely honest. Yeah. It's not, and the Giants have had a lot of early first round picks lately. So it's kind of a different, a change in the norm for us. But I would say this, it's a good year for us to not have that blue chip type range of pick, because I don't know, even if the Giants picked at like 11 right now, Nick, I don't know that our list of our short list would look that much. Like we'd have the corners. We pray that one of those two corners fell or something.
But even with Witherspoon, like the guy started a lot at Illinois, but he had 1 year of like elite production. It's just the movement skills are just so freaking like crazy. The man coverage ability. It's like, will that fade? And then I'm also like, I don't think he played Ohio State this year. I don't think Indiana, they didn't play Ohio. So like, who has he really played? Like that starts going into it. Like, it's just like, I'm not sure, but I just look at the traits and I'm like, the traits are there. Like, I don't care if he's going against me. It's like he's right. He's everywhere. Like the movement skills is unique. The anticipation, and then this like he has like a Brian Dawkins element of physicality.
I know he has that Brian Dawkins dog in him. He really does. And I hate bringing up Dawkins as that guy because I still have memories of when he came with Ike Hilliard, made that catch over the middle, and he like ruined Ike Hilliard's career basically on what should have been a legal hit. And now would be you'd get ejected for making a hit like that. But like it was totally a targeting play in my opinion, at least. But it was old school NFL. But
back then it was like accepted to do that though. Like it's like you come over the middle of the field, you know what you're getting yourself into.
You're gonna get decapitated, right? Exactly. And Hilliard was never scared to go over the middle. So anyway, these are the three centers. We broke them all down. Hopefully you enjoyed this and got a better feel for each of them. We're all in this. I think Nick and I are in the same camp basically on this. We put Tippmann and John-Michael Schmitz ahead of Luke Wypler. Both Tippmann and John-Michael Schmitz are players we would like the Giants to take if they're there in round 2. They're not players we would like them to take at 25 overall. Thanks again for tuning into the Big Blue Banter podcast. Remember, if you want to help us grow, there's only one thing we'll ever ask of you. It's to rate and review us on iTunes. Leave us a rating, a 5-star review. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you find it. Make sure you set up auto download. And you could delete the podcast after, but it's really key that you download for us. And then YouTube, if you're watching there, we really need to grow out YouTube. So we need your help. We need you to like videos. If you're watching, click that like button, please, and click subscribe. But we're still at a bad ratio from like to subscribes here. We got like over 3K subscribers, and then we get like 5,000 to 7,000 views on some of these videos, but only like 30 likes. We need to hit like at least triple-digit likes on these videos. So just hit that like button. It takes 1 second of your time. And finally, if you want to have your mock draft reviewed by us, Nick and I, the Big Blue Banter guys, type it into your podcast review on iTunes. I don't think you can do it on Spotify. I think you can't do a written review, but if you have iTunes, go ahead, drop your mock draft there. I just checked before this podcast, didn't see any, but the minute we start seeing mock drafts drop there in the iTunes reviews, we'll start reading them out and grading them on this pod. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.